Welcome everyone to today's Synergist webinar, How Do European Regulators Enforce Recycling Regulations? I'm Kay Bechtold, Managing Editor of the Synergist, the magazine of AIHA. I'd like to thank all of our attendees and especially Sphera for sponsoring today's webinar. Our speaker today is Jordan Gerling, a Senior Manager at Sphera. He is a recognized industry expert in global extended producer responsibility legislation for waste from electrical and electronic equipment, as well as batteries and packaging recycling regulations. Jordan has assisted more than 200 manufacturers around the world to meet regulations related to registration, collection, recycling, and reporting obligations. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Jordan.
Thank you very much, Kay. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join today's webinar on how European regulators enforce recycling regulations. We will start the webinar today by providing some information on its structure. Firstly, I will give a very brief introduction of my company, Sphera, as well as the specific Sphera product that I work on, EC4P, acronym for Environmental Compliance for Products. After providing some background information about extended producer responsibility regulations, how such regulations are structured, and which companies have obligations under these regulations, I will dive into the possible enforcement actions, as well as examples of enforcement taken by regulators in 3 key European markets, Germany, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. Then I will elaborate on some specific targeted enforcement programs that regulators in Germany and Ireland have adopted. Following all of the information about possible fines and recent enforcement examples, I will explain how companies can firstly identify non-compliant competitors and secondly report their competitors, the non-compliant competitors, to regulators so that the regulators can take enforcement action against them. Just a highlight regarding that section of the webinar, my intention here is not to educate people on how to report their competitors for non-compliance, merely to just highlight how easy it is to do. I just want to highlight that in practice, this does happen, which presents risks for non-compliant companies. The business culture in some European countries is very different to business culture in North America, whereby in some countries, European competitors are likely to report North American companies to the European regulators if the European competitor finds that the North American company is non-compliant. This is standard business practice in some parts of Europe. And finally, to close the webinar, given the dramatic increase of online sales over the last several years, we will discuss how regulators are tackling the non-compliance of online sellers. Like I mentioned, my name is Jordan Gerling and I am a Senior Manager at Sphera. So that you all know who is speaking today, I'm just giving a quick introduction about myself. I have been working in the realm of extended producer responsibility for the last 7 years, specifically focused on helping manufacturers and sellers to comply with WEEE, e-waste, packaging, and batteries extended producer responsibility obligations around the world. Some background information about the company that I work for, Sphera. Sphera is a global leader in integrated risk management, offering software and information services with a focus on environmental health, safety and sustainability, operational risk management, and product stewardship. Sphera's overarching mission is to create a safer, more sustainable, and more productive world. Now I would like to provide some background information about the specific regulations that we are considering as part of this webinar. I will explain why the regulations exist, as well as which companies have obligations under said regulations, so that when we get to the main portion of the webinar, the enforcement sections, it is clear about the types of companies that are facing possible enforcement action and why. As I am sure that everyone attending this webinar is aware of, the incorrect disposal of waste, especially hazardous waste such as electronics and batteries, can have a significant negative impact on the environment and human health, including emissions from processing plants and leaching into water sources. Thus, regulations were introduced to limit the human and environmental impacts. Partially as a result of heavy campaigning by Greenpeace, two types of regulations were developed to address environmental impacts in two main ways. One set of regulations, the restriction of hazardous substance regulations, were designed to stop electronic products containing so many hazardous substances in the first instance. These regulations require manufacturers to ensure that their products do not exceed content thresholds of hazardous substances, such as lead and cadmium, for example. And to help manufacturers comply with these obligations, the BombCheck Sphera product was developed. BombCheck allows manufacturers to gather information on hazardous substances from their suppliers to ensure that their finished products are compliant. The second set of regulations were designed to ensure that when electronic products do eventually arise as waste, they will be reused and recycled rather than being disposed of in landfills or harvested for raw materials in countries like China. These regulations require manufacturers and sellers to finance the costs of recycling the products that they place on the market. These recycling regulations are the main focus of today's webinar. To help manufacturers and sellers comply with their recycling obligations, the EC4P Sphera product was developed. EC4P, Environmental Compliance for Products, helps manufacturers and sellers to comply with their extended producer responsibility obligations in any country around the world that has implemented such legislation. The recycling regulations that we just discussed are the first introduction of the term extended producer responsibility, because companies not only have obligations to fulfill when the product is manufactured, but their obligations are extended so that they have responsibilities after the product has been sold. The producer must coordinate and pay for products to be recycled once they arise as waste. Extended producer responsibility recycling regulations apply primarily to electronic products and any batteries, either integrated into electronic products or sold separately, and the packaging which is used on the product. More recently, regulators have started to develop extended producer responsibility regulations for things like textiles and industrial fishing equipment, but these regulations are much less developed. The EU WEEE Directive, the EU Batteries Directive, and the EU Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive are all published by the European Commission. Every EU member state must publish European Commission environmental directives into national law. This means that there are 27 versions of the EU WEEE Directive, 27 versions of the EU Batteries Directive, and 27 versions of the EU Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive. Every EU member state transposes the requirements of the European Commission directives into national legislation slightly differently, which means that the way manufacturers and sellers are expected to comply with the various obligations for registration, reporting, and equipment collection and recycling varies from country to country. When the EFTA countries are considered, Norway, Switzerland and Iceland, as well as the UK, that gives manufacturers and sellers over 93 different regulations to comply with if they were selling electronic products across Europe. There are 4 distinct activities that will give you obligations as a WEEE producer in EU member states, 3 of which only apply if the company is based within the country of sale. If a company is located in the country of sale and either manufactures and sells electronics under their own brand, resells electronics under their own brand, i.e. the electronics that were manufactured by someone else but have been rebranded, or imports and subsequently sells electronics, they are obligated as a WEEE producer in that country. Also, foreign companies are obligated as a WEEE producer in the country of sale if they distance sell directly to end users. WEEE producers firstly must register as such with the regulator in the country of sale. The way in which registrations must be completed is determined by the types of products that are being sold and the way that they are being sold. A local company will need to register in a different way than a foreign company would, for example. The WEEE producer must then implement appropriate arrangements to finance and coordinate the collection and recycling of waste products. And again, what is determined as appropriate arrangements is determined by the types of products that are being sold. Once a WEEE producer has registered with the regulator and implemented collection and recycling compliance arrangements, they must begin submitting regulatory sales declarations systematically in the correct format for the correct frequencies in accordance with regulatory deadlines. The registration, reporting and recycling obligations vary from country to country because each EU member state specifies slightly different requirements in their national legislation. WEEE producers must also ensure that their products are marked correctly, i.e. with a crossed out wheeled bin symbol, and have the ability to provide recycling instructions for their products should they be requested. But these are single market provisions of the Commission level directive, and the specifications of these obligations are typically overarching on the European level. What obligates a company for WEEE typically also obligates a company for batteries and packaging. If a company is located in the country of sale and produces or imports batteries, regardless of whether the batteries are sold separately or incorporated into an electronic product which are packaged, the company also has obligations for batteries and packaging. Whilst the original European Commission level Batteries Directive and Packaging Waste Directive do not directly obligate foreign companies that distance sell directly to end users, like the WEEE directive does, many EU member state regulators have adopted the same obligation as for WEEE, whereby companies are obligated for the batteries and packaging too. I think about 18 of the 27 member states obligate foreign sellers for batteries, and 11 of the 27 member states obligate foreign sellers for packaging. And similarly to WEEE obligations, batteries and packaging producers must register as such, implement appropriate collection and recycling compliance arrangements for each waste stream, and begin submitting regulatory sales declarations for batteries and packaging, as well as comply with various single market provisions, such as labelling requirements and substance restrictions. Now we are going to dive into the penalties that companies can receive for not complying with their e-waste batteries and packaging obligations, as well as examples of recent enforcement activities taken by regulators for three case study countries: Germany, Ireland, and the UK. In Germany, companies can receive fines of 100,000 euros per offence. But most notably, and probably the most costly to companies, is that they can receive forced stop sells until they have implemented suitable compliance arrangements. As it typically takes several months for producer registrations to be processed and subsequently approved in Germany, companies can lose significant amounts of money when they cannot sell products into a major European market for several months. An example of recent enforcement action in Germany is that in 2020, Tesla will fine 12 million euros for not complying with their recycling obligations for the batteries contained within their electric vehicles. Earlier in 2021, the German regulator amended the national WEEE regulations to stipulate that retailers and distributors must only sell products from companies that are registered as a producer with the regulator. This also applies to fulfillment centers, which process and ship customer orders on behalf of companies. They can only provide such services to compliant companies. This increased level of enforcement, which will take effect from 1st of January 2022, is designed to stop non-compliant companies being able to sell products in Germany. Germany has gone above and beyond that of most European regulators by not only fining non-compliant companies directly, but by denying them access to the German market indirectly by removing the channels available to them for non-compliant sales. The German regulator has also begun to identify particular industries where non-compliance is rife, which are industries that will be scrutinized and investigated by the regulator. This particular document was published by the German regulator, highlights that many companies in the IT and telecommunications industry are not complying with their packaging waste obligations in Germany. This German regulator publication highlights rife non-compliance in the fashion industry. And this online publication highlights that from April 2021, the German regulator has a digital portal to facilitate their enforcement proceedings. The system transmits evidence and generates company-specific files and possible enforcement actions under the legislation automatically. It is thought that this system will increase the amount of enforcement activity in Germany, both by the total value of the fines issued and by the sheer number of fines issued too. Now to look at a case study for Ireland, an EU member state notorious for severe penalties. Under Ireland's Waste Management Act, companies not complying with their WEEE obligations can face fines up to 10 million euros, 10 years imprisonment for company directors, or both. Also, when a company first registers with a regulator in Ireland, they must declare whether they have had compliance obligations in previous years of non-registration, and if so, pay retrospective registration fees, compliance scheme membership fees, and authorised representative service fees. Recently, the Irish Environmental Protection Agency introduced the concept of fixed payment notices, or FPNs. FPNs are on-the-spot fines that the Irish EPA can issue to non-compliant companies without taking them through court proceedings. Whilst the value of the potential penalties are lower than those specified under the National Waste Management Act, they are still sizable. 2,000 euros for failing to register with the regulator, for example, and they can be issued much more easily. An example of WEEE enforcement in Ireland is that a company called I Spy CCTV were fined 25,000 euros for failing to register for WEEE with the national regulator and for failing to submit sales declarations accordingly. In the United Kingdom, the fines that companies can receive for WEEE and batteries non-compliance are not capped, and the fines that companies can receive for packaging non-compliance are typically up to about £25,000 per offence. As examples, a company called LEC Limited were fined £120,000 for failing to register for packaging with the regulator and for failing to take reasonable steps to recover and recycle waste packaging. A company called Babs Media were fined £45,000 for failing to register for WEEE and batteries with the regulator and for failing to finance the collection, treatment and recovery of WEEE and waste batteries. Now we have a few slides to highlight how EU regulators encourage companies to report competitors for non-compliance, to WEEE batteries and packaging recycling regulations, including competitors selling products via online web stores. The business culture in some European countries is very different to the business culture in North America, whereby in some countries, European competitors are likely to report North American companies to the European regulators if the European competitor finds that the North American company is non-compliant. And this is standard business practice in some parts of Europe. Many regulatory authorities publish lists of companies that are compliant to the regulations in their country, and competitors can check publicly available lists and report non-compliant companies to the regulatory authorities. Most companies list the location of their sales offices on their corporate website, and the presence of a sales office in a particular country almost always means that the company has obligations for WEEE batteries and/or packaging in that country. Competitors can check publicly available lists of compliant companies maintained by national regulators to see if the company's local sales office is currently registered, and if not, the company can be reported to the regulator. On the next few slides, I will be demonstrating how someone can report their competitors for non-compliance in some example countries. And just to reiterate from the beginning of the presentation, my intention here is not to educate people on how to report their competitors, so I don't go into huge amounts of detail. My intention is merely to highlight how easy it is to do. And I just want to highlight that in practice, this does happen, which presents risks for non-compliant companies. An organization called EWRN, the European WEEE Registers Network, maintains a reporting form and contact information for every European WEEE regulator should a competitor wish to report a company for non-compliance in numerous EU member states at any one time. This is a section of the Dutch WEEE Regulators website, which allows companies to report competitors for non-compliance via a hotline. Similarly, this is a section of the Danish WEEE Regulators website, DPA system, which allows companies to report competitors for non-compliance. Companies can click on the whistleblower tab to easily report their competitors for the non-compliance. This is an example of the publicly available list of WEEE compliant companies in Germany. If you were to search for a company, it would show you if they are currently registered as a producer. On this slide, for example, you can see that Apple are registered as a WEEE producer in Germany, as most of us would expect. If a company is not listed on the publicly available list of WEEE compliant companies, a competitor may identify this and choose to report the non-compliant company to the regulator. To move on to the last step of the webinar, there are a few slides to discuss and explain recent increased levels of enforcement against online sellers. Traditionally, enforcement activities were focused on companies with a national presence, such as a sales office. Over the last several years, for obvious reasons, the quantity of online sales has increased dramatically, and online sellers, especially those based abroad, typically have lower levels of compliance. With the percentage of sales from non-compliant companies increasing, there is a smaller proportion of waste which has prior funding for recycling and end-of-life treatment. Thus, the regulators needed to target enforcement on online sellers to increase the levels of compliance in that sector. In December 2020, over 150 participants, including regulators from 10 different EU member states, attended a meeting organised by the European Association of Lighting WEEE compliance schemes to discuss national approaches to prevent non-compliance sales through online marketplaces. Recently, 5 leading NGOs released an open letter calling on German ministers to act against online free riders. Back in March 2019, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation published a report recommending measures to tackle free riding, including increased enforcement for online sales. The latest UK waste strategy mentions that proposed regulation reviews will lead to the introduction of measures to tackle non-compliance from online sellers. And this year, an EU market surveillance regulation came into force requiring online sellers, for example, Amazon and eBay, to evidence compliance for non-EU manufacturers selling on their websites. And just yesterday morning, I was reading an article which highlighted that Amazon have very recently contacted all of their Germany and France sellers, requesting evidence of their WEEE batteries and packaging compliance. Any companies that wish to continue selling via Amazon will need to be fully compliant with WEEE batteries and packaging legislation in those 2 countries. And now we have a few slides just to demonstrate how topical non-compliance with extended producer responsibility provisions from online sales is. This is a particular article is published by a UK-based consultancy about the impact of online sales. Here are 3 news articles which focus on increasing levels of enforcement against non-compliant online sellers, and some articles from Let's Recycle highlighting how the number of non-compliant online sellers are increasing, as well as how new obligations for online sellers may be implemented. Here are some publications from amalgamations of WEEE compliance schemes. Non-compliant online sales have a very negative impact on compliance schemes. The more sales there are, the more WEEE on the market that needs to be collected and recycled. Non-compliant sales mean that there are less funds to finance the collection and recycling of WEEE on the market, which in turn increases the costs for the companies that are compliant because they are financing more than they are actually placing on the market themselves. Thus, compliance schemes and compliant sellers regularly put pressure on regulators to increase levels of enforcement against non-compliant sellers. The biggest proportion of non-compliant sellers are online sellers, and therefore there is a lot of development in this area. This is another article which highlights the negative impact that online sales are having on the concept of extended producer responsibility, and a couple more slides from other sources just to highlight the extent of this topic. What you are seeing now is an interactive map which demonstrates the level of risk for non-compliant companies in particular European countries, but also across North America. The map also shows how complex the registration and reporting processes are in each country, as well as various other considerations. It offers the ability to download country PDF profiles, which provides information about specific in-country WEEE batteries and packaging legislation. This map is often used by companies that have realized that they are non-compliant in quite a few different countries, but need to prioritize how they go about closing their compliance gaps, usually for cost reasons. This map is free of charge to use on our website. During the webinar, we have given some examples of enforcement possibilities and recent enforcement action taken by national regulators in Germany, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. The enforcement guides, which can be downloaded from our website free of charge, provide similar information for other countries other than Germany, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. The enforcement guides provide information and examples on other European countries, but also countries outside of Europe. For example, this is a snip of the USA section of the document. It highlights that Home Depot will fine $27 million for the unlawful disposal of hazardous waste, which included e-waste and batteries. This is a snip of the India section of the document, which highlights suspended sales for several high-profile companies, including Apple, Samsung, HP, and Motorola. Customs authorities in India seized over 630 million euros worth of equipment until the associated companies implemented appropriate compliance arrangements. Well, we hope that you have enjoyed today's short webinar. You can register for our next webinar already, which is taking place on 10th of November. The slides of this webinar will be made available afterwards, so that those of you that wish to register have access to the registration link. During the next webinar, Sphera EC4P's 1, 2, 3 step process to help you implement a robust global e-waste batteries and packaging compliance program will be demonstrated, including identify your compliance exposure with EC4P's online compliance risk map, country risk profiles, and accompanying informative resources. Staying on top of the expanding and evolving recycling laws applicable to your products with EC4P's customizable regulatory monitoring service, and how the approach lets EC4P's expert consultants and best-in-class software guarantee your global compliance program with our managed compliance services. So I'll pass back to Kay, our mediator. Seems like we have plenty of time for questions, which is good.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jordan. Yep, we've got plenty of time for questions. Just a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the chat window on the right side of your screen and send to all panelists or everyone if you'd like. I have a couple of questions already, and the first one is, how do you recommend I collect packaging data for reporting, and how accurate must data be?
So there's a variety of different ways you can collect packaging data for reporting. Most companies can either get the data from their suppliers and amalgamate it. A lot of companies do sample weighing, so they will take a sample of most of the popular products. If a couple of products are taking up 90% of your sales, weigh the packaging for those products and then extrapolate it onwards. In terms of accuracy, if you were to submit a UK packaging declaration, the phrase on the reporting form does say as accurate as reasonably possible. That it does vary from country to country. Some regulators will expect it to be entirely accurate, but most regulators seem to be okay with you having, almost perfect packaging data. As long as you're trying to improve the accuracy over time, they seem to be happy with that.
Okay, thank you. The next question I have is, well, first a statement. Online retailers, specifically Amazon, have been asking for voluntary certifications / approvals with delisting to follow. How can manufacturers combat this?
That's a difficult question, and it would depend on the situation of the manufacturer. In some instances, they don't have to necessarily voluntarily register and implement compliance arrangements, but of course, the sellers like Amazon, they do have a lot of driving power. If you might not have direct legal obligations, but if you want to sell through their platform, you will have to register voluntarily. It depends on industry mass, I suppose. But yeah, that's a difficult question. And if you come back to us after the webinar about the specific situation of this manufacturer, I'll try and provide some more detailed guidance.
Okay, thank you. The next question I have is, to what do you attribute the failure of large global companies with well-staffed compliance offices to be non-compliant? This is referring to the slide regarding enforcement in India.
Usually you see non-compliance because of new regulations and new requirements. And sometimes it's not necessarily the legislation, but it's how the regulators are interpreting the legislation and expecting companies to comply. So whilst you may have internal teams of compliance officers that it's their job to maintain existing compliance arrangements, one of the hardest things is to track new legislation and amendments to existing legislation, but also to try and gather feedback on how the regulators are expecting the manufacturers to comply with certain provisions of the legislation, and also how the rest of the industry are complying. If you're not chatting with other industry associates and you're going to implement something in a completely different way to the rest of the industry, chances are there's going to be a non-compliant stamp somewhere.
Okay, great. The next question I have is for SCIP reporting, where manufacturers have to submit SCIP data for REACH affected parts to the European Chemicals Agency portal. How is this data accessible to recyclers and how do they use it?
So I would request that that question is sent to me after the call, and I will direct it to my colleagues who are experts in SCIP. My experience directly relates to EPR, extended producer responsibility, so it's not an area that I have a lot of expertise, so I don't feel too comfortable answering that question.
Okay, no problem. We'll make sure it gets over to you. The next question I have is, are there similar regulations outside of Europe that will affect manufacturers in the same way? And if so, is the enforcement similar outside of Europe?
Yes, there are. Many countries in North America, South America, APAC, etc., have implemented similar e-waste batteries and packaging EPR regulations as in Europe. The scope of the regulations does vary from country to country. In Europe, it tends to be much more developed, so you might have a piece of electronic equipment which is classed as obligated in Europe, but not in Canada and the US, for example. The amount of enforcement that is noticeable outside of Europe is typically less frequent when compared with Europe. It does happen, and when it does happen, it can be considerable. For example, the India and US fines I gave on the last few slides.
Okay, great. The next question I have is, how is the one-use plastic coming along in the EU?
It's developing. The Single-Use Plastics Directive and somewhat the Circular Economy Directive are making some steps in those areas. There has been a lot of development, especially over the last 6 months, with different member states implementing the Single-Use Plastics Directive, and as is most environmental directives in Europe, there are a lot of deviations from member state transpositions, which are going to make it a little bit tricky for sellers and manufacturers to comply. But we have a ton of information on the different implementations in different countries, so I'm happy to provide lots of detail about that if you have questions about specific countries later on.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next question I have is, if a seller has obligations for WEEE, do they also have obligations for the packaging and batteries by default?
Well, we can address that question on two paths. On the first path, we can look at companies with a physical presence in the country of sale. In that scenario, typically, if you have obligations for WEEE, then you'll also have obligations for packaging. On the second approach, we're looking at companies without a physical presence in the country of sale, so the foreign online sellers that we were just speaking about. Foreign companies selling directly to end customers will usually have obligations for WEEE in all 27 EU member states. Whether the company has obligations for batteries or packaging is dependent on the country of sale. because the national legislation varies somewhat in that regard. For example, in Slovakia, if a US seller was selling to an end customer in Slovakia, they would have obligations for WEEE batteries and packaging. But if the same company was selling to Cyprus, for example, I think they're only obligated for WEEE and not for the batteries and packaging.
Okay, great. Thank you. My next question is, if a non-EU manufacturer uses distributors within the EU, is the manufacturer only responsible for addressing WEEE obligations in the countries of the distributors, as the manufacturer may not know where in the EU the end customer is?
Well, in that scenario, it's normally actually the distributor that has the obligations, rather than the non-EU manufacturer. Um, In some instances, the distributor may require the non-EU manufacturer to register for WEEE on their behalf. That might be why you're asking that particular question. And if you are going to register on the distributor's behalf, in practice, you only register in that country that you're selling to the distributor. If that distributor is then going to go off and sell directly to end customers in loads of different countries, you're not expected to comply on their behalf on all of the different countries, mainly because it's very hard to track how those products are being sold. Your distributor, for example, they might not sell to an end user. In many cases, I'm sure they will, but they might sell to another reseller who sells to somewhere else, and it's very difficult to track.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple more questions in the queue. Just wanted to remind everyone, if you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the chat box and send it either to everyone or all panelists. Jordan, the next question I have is, why has Ireland introduced fixed payment notices when regulators could already prosecute companies under the Waste Management Act?
So, under the Waste Management Act, the Irish regulator can issue much larger fines when compared with those that can be issued as fixed payment notices. When fines are issued under the Waste Management Act, they're quite difficult to enforce. Usually the regulator needs to initiate court proceedings, which naturally are quite timely and costly. So whilst the values of the fines that can be issued under fixed payment notices are much lower, they can be issued much more easily, and thus that they are issued much more frequently. And I think the main idea behind this is that lower level fines, which are issued more frequently, they typically tend to encourage compliance before major legislative offences occur.
Okay, thank you. The next question I have is, why does enforcement seem to be increasing faster against online sellers when compared to more conventional sellers?
So over the last decade or so, the amount of online sales has increased dramatically, as we all know, especially during the last couple of years during the pandemic. Online sellers typically have lower levels of compliance, largely because many of them are foreign, and it is more challenging for national regulators to conduct enforcement proceedings against foreign companies, especially those that are located outside of Europe. As the percentage of non-compliant sales increased, this means that there's more waste requiring collection and recycling, but no additional funds to finance it. And like I mentioned in the slide deck, this increases costs for the companies that are compliant because they are financing the collection and recycling of larger proportions of waste. And regulators do receive pressure from compliant companies to imply enforcement action against non-compliant companies because non-compliance increases the costs for compliant companies. And with such a large number of online sellers being non-compliant, that's where the predominance of non-compliance is, especially since 2012, when foreign distance sellers mainly became obligated. This is where most regulators have decided to focus most of their efforts recently.
Okay, great. Thank you. At this point, I don't have any additional questions left in the queue, but oh, I got a comment actually. I think, sorry, Even companies that are outside of the EU who sell in the EU must have a legal entity within the EU now, so this is how regulators can act, is the comment or note. Don't know if you wanted to respond to that, Jordan.
Yeah, that's right. That's referring to Article 17 of the directive, so I think, where foreign sellers are required to appoint an authorized representative. So that's a requirement of the legislation, and then the enforcement can be applied against the authorized representative on behalf of the foreign company. That's a good concept in some regards, but it's not such a good concept in other regards. So if a seller was going to completely ignore all of their obligations, so they don't fulfill the obligation of appointing that authorized representative in the first instance, but they're still selling, in that scenario, there's no authorized representative to apply the enforcement actions against. But it is a good point. There is a requirement to appoint the representative in EU countries where you're selling.
Okay, thank you. I've got another question now. As customers/consumers, do you have any advice for us to help encourage compliance of the vendors we buy from, especially online?
Good question. In a lot of different European countries, there are requirements for manufacturers and sellers to display certain information to you as the customer and the consumer. It does vary from country to country, but like in Germany, for example, if you buy a product, on the website that you're buying the product and on any kind of sales invoice that you receive from the seller, it should say the WEEE registration number on it, and it should explain what it is. It will say WEEE reg number. So if you're getting invoices or you're trying to buy products online and you can't see that information available, if you were to ask the seller and point out that that is a legal requirement for them to be WEEE registered, if they're getting some pressure from their customers who are trying to buy their products, that might push them into becoming compliant if they're perhaps not already.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jordan. At this point, I don't have any other questions right now, but since we have a little over 10 minutes still left in the hour, just wanted to give people a little bit more time to get in their questions if they had any. Just wondering if you had any concluding thoughts or any additional anything additional you'd like to add just while we're want to give people a little bit more time in case they think of a question.
Yeah, not too much to add from me. Like I say, I didn't go into a lot of detail when I was showing the slides about how you can report. That there are different websites in different countries where you can report competitors, and sometimes quite often the regulators even encourage people to enforce their report their non-compliant competitors, which, like I say, in some cases, in some countries in North America, might be considered a little bit unethical, and in some parts of Europe, it's standard business practice. So, yeah, it's up to people and companies to decide whether or not they want to start reporting their non-compliant competitors, but there are lots of different resources available to people who are non-compliant. So on one of the slides I mentioned EWRN have a reporting form, but at the same time, in parallel, they also provide lots of advice and guidance on how companies can comply. So there's resources out there to help companies as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. I do have another question for you now. Chris asks, do you think that the WEEE symbol will be implemented worldwide?
That is a very good concept, and I wish it would be, because universality would make it very easy for consumers to understand what it means, especially if it's used outside of Europe. Realistically and practically, no, I can't see that happening anytime soon.
Great. Yeah, he says, we wish to. There are already tons of marks on some products. Great. Yeah, lots of great comments from everyone attending, very informative and important for our future. So thanks for a great presentation, Jordan. Don't see any other questions. I'm going to give a couple more seconds here in case anyone thinks of anything, so I don't cut anyone off. Getting lots of thank yous. All right, I'm going to start wrapping it up here, unless I get another question. So if there aren't any more questions, we'll go ahead and conclude today's webinar. My thanks to Jordan Gerling for his presentation, to Spira for sponsoring today's webinar, and to all of our participants. Wanted to let everyone know that registration is open for 2 upcoming Synergist webinar events. On September 21st, Velocity EHS will present a product demo titled Industrial Hygiene Spotlight, the Smart Way to Manage Your IH Program. And on October 6th, join us for 7 Steps to Improve Your Industrial Hygiene Program, a Synergist webinar also sponsored by Velocity EHS. Thanks again for everyone, and have a great day.
All right. Thank you, everyone. This actually concludes today's webcast. Thank you all for attending. The recording will be available at aiha.webfin.tv, and we will send all registrants an email tomorrow with that link. And please visit our event calendar to sign up for future webcasts.